Hey everyone, my name is Coltrol. In previous tutorial we learned how to create smoke effect using only textures. But we also ran into some complications. This method has some downsides. So in this tutorial we will talk about the second method of creating smoke in Verge3D. This method will involve particles, but we will create particles ourselves. And this method will also fix some complications and problems that we previously had with the first method. This method is achieved using only Verge3D puzzles without any coding. And even better, you will not need to set everything up. You can just take the XML file, Visual Logic, and put it into your project and make a little bit of preparations in Blend file. So in this tutorial in part 2 we will learn how to use this method, because it has some complicated logic and it needs its own tutorial, by the way, coming up, part 3. But to just use it and set it up, basically we'll only need this control panel. It will allow us to set up the correct behavior of the smoke accordingly to our task. Because we may need fast rising smoke, slow rising smoke, dense smoke, not so dense smoke, we may also have winds and etc. etc. Alright, so let's start by looking at the control panel. The first element is scale, or particle size, and well, it does what it says it does. It changes the size of the particles which are being generated. For example, let's set the scale to 2. It will not change instantly and we need to save it and reload the scene, because if we just save it and start it, we may run into some problems. And as you can see, the smoke looks thicker. We now have particles twice as big. Let's set it back to 1. The second option is speed, or particle moving speed. It is how fast the smoke is rising up. Let's keep in mind it is global z-axis, so it rises globally up. This is very delicate variable, so we are using very small numbers. Let's change it from 007 to 014, or twice as fast. Save and reload to see how they will move now. Alright, now the rising speed of the smoke is twice as fast. But you may notice the smoke doesn't rise further up. We will talk about it a little bit later, it is another effect. Alright, let's turn the speed back to 007 and talk about next effects. But first, of course, let's save and reload. So randomness is how chaotic smoke behaves. Right now it rises almost straight up, but with some turbulence. If we set randomness to 0, the smoke will rise straight upwards, and it will be kinda noticeable. It will look more like a water flow than a smoke. So maybe we don't want it, except maybe if it is the candle flame. So let's turn it a little bit up to 5. And now smoke behaves more turbulent, it moves to other sides more frequently. Of course, smoke is pretty fluid, it behaves differently depending on the situation, wind, etc. etc. So I have set randomness to 3 by default, because it is something in between. Alright, the next setting is lifetime. Basically, lifetime is how much the smoke particle lives. Let's set it to 1. And now smoke disappears faster. Now it disappears here, while before it disappeared somewhere there. This is one of the methods which helps us to control how long the smoke stays on a scene. There is also another method, but we will look at it a bit later. The next setting is size change, probably the most sensitive control of all of the settings. If we look closer, we may notice that the particles shrink in size while going up. It is done to simulate the dissipation or scattering of smoke through the air. So if we want particles to dissipate much faster, let's set it to 0.93. And actually let's move everything down a bit so the bloom doesn't outshine the smoke. We may notice that there are tiny particles here. So it's kind of works similar to lifetime, but they both work in tandem. Lifetime is how much the particle is present, and size change is how fast it shrinks. And of course you don't want the particle to shrink too slow and to disappear instantly when the lifetime ends. Though if you want particles to actually grow with time, maybe we have very intense smoke, it is better to set it to 0.98. This is kind of equilibrium, the particles stay almost the same. But if we add even tiny bit more, we will now have huge particles, and in most situations we don't want that, they become really big. So it is better to use something around 985. That will give us some upward scaling and will not go too extreme. But you may also ask why the particles are scaling up and we don't see them actually disappearing, because before they were shrinking to zero and now they don't. Again, we will talk about it a little bit later. It is a special effect which helps us dissipate smoke in a smooth way. Alright, let's set it back to 9.7 and look at the final setting. Density. Basically, it is how thick the smoke will be, or how much particles we will have. Again, this is one of the more sensitive settings, and we need to use it with caution, because if we create too much particles, the browser might lag or even crash. Also, it works inverted, so if we set it to 0.12 from 0.06, the smoke will be twice less dense. We will cut our particle counts in half. And on contrary, if we want thicker smoke, we need to set density to lower number. Let's say 0.03. Now the smoke is twice as thick. It is much more noticeable than before. But again, I would strongly recommend not to use very low numbers, because if we lower the number even more, the particle counts will rise dramatically. And too much particles leads to slower scene. Also, if we have too much particles, we may start noticing something like tiling. The smoke will be more fluid-like, and we don't want it. For denser smoke, it is better to set up the material of the particle. So I recommend setting density to somewhere around 0.03 to 0.06. Alright, and that wraps up the control panel. That is almost everything that we need to know to use this effect. There is one more moment. Let's look at this setup right here. Again, we will not look through it fully, it will be done in the next part, but we want this puzzle right here. Let's say we don't need smoke to rise up, for example if we have a rocket. So let's enable this puzzle, and as you can see it has X and Y offset. This will be X and Y direction of the smoke. So here we manually change the smoke direction. Right now it is set up to 009 and 009. Let's save and see how it works. And as you can see, the smoke changed its direction. Now it moves diagonally. Thanks to this puzzle, we can set the smoke to any direction that we need. Of course, we can reverse it. And the direction will reverse as well. And of course, we can do the same for Z-axis. But there is one moment. As you can see, it rises horizontally. It is because it conflicts with speed. Speed is Z's up axis, and here we have Z down axis. So we need to set Z here even lower to counteract this motion. Also, of course, we can just reverse speed, but it is easier for me to do it in one puzzle. And of course, if we want only upwards motion of the smoke, we can just right-click it and disable the puzzle. Alright, now we have looked through everything that this setup has. It has a lot of options to set up the smoke just like we want. Or, well, maybe some other visual effects using particles. And again, these particles are globally placed, so they will stay in a place where they initially were created, despite of any possible animations. Alright, and now let's learn how to implement this effect, this setup, to your own project. So, let's say we have a motorcycle silencer, and we want to present it. For that, we want to add a little effect, so the smoke will come out of the pipe, something like this. It will be a better demonstration for marketing purposes, because it will look like the silencer is working. So let's see how easy it will be to add this smoke effect and set it up. First, we need to add the plane where we want the particles to start from. Then let's rotate it so it will look at camera. Scale it a bit more tweaks, and yeah, looks alright. For the next part, we want to track this plane to camera, so it will always be looking at camera. Because if we don't do so, we will get something that we had in previous tutorial. Under one angle it will be a nice plane, and under another angle it will be invisible. So to do that, we need to select the plane, go to constraints, and set the constraints track to. Here as a target we need to set the camera. Alright, and done, the plane is looking at camera. Now actually let's check if the plane is looking at camera with its correct side. For that, let's enable face orientation and select any of the shaded modes, so material preview or rendered. And as we can see, the plane shows red, while everything else shows as blue. It means that the plane is inverted, and we need to fix it. We can rotate it, or we can just select Z instead of -Z axis in the constraint track axis setting. Alright, now everything is correct. Let's turn the face orientation off again, and now we have this plane looking at camera with its correct side. Now we need to name this plane 1. It will be our first particle. We need to name it exactly like this for the puzzle setup to work correctly. Alright, and well, basically that is all we need for a quick smoke setup. It will work just like that, only by adding the plane, tracking it to camera, and naming the plane 1. Let's see how it works, so let's export it to Verge3D. And here we go. Of course we don't have any logic so far, so it only looks at camera. Now we just need to copy the logic, the XML file, which will be available in the description. After downloading it, we just need to put this file into our project folder. So let's do just that. Here are two Visual Logic files and we need only XML file. So let's copy it and place it into our project folder. And here let's replace it. Now let's just reload the puzzles. And here we have our setup. As you can see, the particles are already working. Of course, for now we don't have the full effects. We only have white planes rising. To make them look like smoke, we need to go back to Blender and set up the material for the smoke. And back to Blender we are. Here I have prepared two textures. First is the cloud texture and the second is circular gradient. These are two textures which, when combined together, will create the smoke texture with smooth borders. Of course, you can combine them manually, maybe in Photoshop or other 2D editor, and actually it will be better for optimization. But for the sake of simplicity, we will do it in Blender. So we have created a material for smoke. Let's add these textures here and actually enable the transparency for the material. For that, let's go to options and here set blends mode to alpha blend. Alright, now let's combine the textures using converter math. Let's combine both of them, plug the results to alpha and change it to multiply. Alright, and now we have it. Let's change base color to something darker. And here we go, the borders are smooth. Now we need something to control the transparency. Let's add another multiply node, and using it we can control how pronounced the particle looks. And that will be simplest particle smoke setup. Now let's export it to Verge3D. Here, let's reload the scene. Alright, now we can see it working. Well, first of all, it is going only up, and we want the smoke to go diagonally, down. So, let's set it up using this puzzle. First, let's enable it and set the positions. Z to -0.1 position, Y we will leave as is, and X to 0. Alright, looks about right. Well, one particle is stuck here. It will go away when we reload the page. Alright, and well, it kind of works. It's not something that I will call the beautiful smoke, but if you look from the distance, it is decent. But of course we need to work a little bit more if we want to look at it closely. The particles, each particle is very noticeable. We can see that the same texture is being used, and that is the first that we will change. Let's go back to Blender. Now we have several ways to solve this problem. We can use different textures, so it will not be as noticeable. But here I will use a little bit different method, a bit simpler. Let's duplicate the plane, call the new plane 2, then let's go to edit modes and rotate UV map by 90 degrees. Now visually the texture will look different. And that's exactly what will help us with this visible tiling effect. Visually it will look a bit different, and that's exactly what we need. Of course you can use different texture and different material, but it is faster. Let's repeat it once more and call the new plane 3. And also rotate it. Actually we can rotate not strictly by 90 degrees, we can use 45 degrees, however we want to. The goal is for it to look a bit different, and it does. Alright, and 3 is enough. Actually 3 is the maximum for the puzzle's logic to work. By the way, we need to make sure that the planes are called exactly like that, even with the third letter being lowercase. Alright, now let's export and see how it looks. Alright, we have officially beaten the tiling, but still the smoke looks a bit too pronounced. Let's go back to Blender and make it a little bit more transparent. Looks good to me. Let's export again. And the smoke looks smoother. Actually it starts from a different point, so let's fix it a bit. Let's place all of them closer to the exhaust pipe. And here we may encounter another problem. We will have the visible border right here. See, the smoke kinda intersects the pipe and it is pretty visible. To make it less visible, we need to use a special trick. Let's select the plane, and in the material we need to turn off Show Backface. Now in material setting, the depth right checkmark will be available. Let's turn it off as well. And also let's turn on backface culling, because we will never see another side of the plane. Alright, let's export. Alright, now it starts exactly where it needs to. To be honest, I think it still is a bit too intense, so let's make it more transparent and a bit brighter as well. We are specifically going through all these steps because these are the problems that you may encounter by implementing it into your project. Not necessarily, but may happen. Also, maybe it looks a bit too slow. Let's make it move faster. We just need to increase Y and Z parameters. Alright, looks fine. Now let's go to the control panel and work a little bit with the parameters here. Let's change lifetime to 3, density to 0.6 to make it a little bit less dense, and add some randomness. Let's set it to 6. Alright, let's see how it looks. Alright, looks even better. But now if we zoom in closely, we can notice individual particles. From far away it looks okay, but here, see, we can notice each of them, and they kinda disappear at some distance. It is not very visible, but still it kinda is. And it is better to control where the particles disappear. So let's go back to Blender, duplicate one of the particles and scale it up, way up. Don't worry, it will be temporary. it will be the indicator for our alpha manipulations. Now let's add input texture coordinates. Here we will need the object's output. Let's plug it right into the base color. Right now we don't have an object for it to work with, so it takes plane coordinates. Let's add an empty and set this empty as a target for the plane. Just like that. Now the coordinates are assigned to plane's material. And now we can take a mask from these coordinates. Let's separate color, add math, and tweak it a bit. Alright, red channel seems to be working diagonally. Let's try green channel, and it works perfectly. We need exactly that, a horizontal mask. Now let's add map range node, so we can manipulate the gradient that we have. Also, let's clamp our add node. It is necessary. So let's set up the gradient. Now we have this flexible border, which is tied to the object. We can also control the gradient by just scaling the empty. So there are two methods to control the gradient. I will be using the scaling method and delete map range, but you can use map range. It works basically the same. Now we have this gradient, and we will use this gradient to control the alpha. So when a particle moves too far from the empty, it will become more and more transparent. This method is pretty easy and will work only by y-axis. If we want it to work globally, we need much more complicated node setup. Here it is. As you can see, we can control it as if it is volumetric. The mesh looks like that, and the setup works like this. So if you need more reliable setup which will work on all axes, feel free to pause the video and replicate these settings. But let's go back. We don't need such complicated setup right here. We will only need y-axis, and this will work just fine. So when we finish setting up the border that will work for our case, let's just place all these nodes down here and multiply it by what we already have going into alpha channel. Alright, now let's delete the big particle. And here we can actually check how it works. Here the texture is visible. When I move here, it becomes invisible. That's exactly what we want. Maybe after adding this border, we will want to multiply it a bit up or down, depending on how the transparency looks like. Alright, and now let's look at the situation when we need to animate this silencer. It will be moving forwards and backwards by y-axis, so first we need to parent empty to the silencer. Now it will always follow it. After parenting empty to the silencer, we need to also parent the particles to it, but not the same way that we did with empty. We need to do it using puzzles. First we need to set the point where the particles will snap to and move from. That will be the origin of the silencer. Right now the origin is in geometrical center. Well, in most cases it is. We need to move it to where the particles will come from. To do that, I have already placed the 3D cursor here, and now we just need to select it and go to Object, Set Origin, Origin to 3D Cursor. Now the origin jumped to the end of the exhaust pipe. It may not work the best with animation, so we can parent it to empty or another object. Alright, after export, we need to go to this panel, and here we need to set up the snap particle to object. Here we have auspuff complex. It is our main silencer. It is called like that. So basically you need to set the object to which the particles will snap to, and the target for snapping will be the origin. By the way, by default in this field will be flame in red letters, because we don't have any object which is called flame in this setup, so we can set our own. Alright, after setting up the object to snap to, let's go to animating. I will create simple animation, moving forwards and backwards. And after animation is done, let's export it to Verge3D. Here we go, the animation works, and we see right away the problem. The smoke is disappearing only on the left side, on the right side it stays as it is. So we need to fix this problem. We need to make this border work for both sides, so it will disappear on the left and on the right. Let's go to Blender. Also, I've noticed that the smoke is almost invisible, so let's multiply it a little bit more. And now let's recreate our huge particle setup. Alright, and now to see the gradient, let's plug in the border into the base color. Also, let's move the empty right to the exhaust pipe. First, let's work a little bit with add to make sure that the border is in its right place. And now let's organize the nodes a little bit, because we will be adding more math. Let's also copy the output so we can switch between two borders. And now let's copy adds, plug green channel into the second value, not the first, and make it subtract, so it will invert itself. And now we have inverted gradients on the right side. That's exactly what we need. Let's set it up, so we are happy how it works. And now let's multiply both gradients. And just like that, we have a gradient right in the center. That will make our particles invisible on both sides when they move away from the exhaust pipe. Now let's plug it back into alpha inputs, delete the second outputs, we don't need it anymore, and that will be our setup. And of course let's delete the huge particle. Most probably we will also want to work a bit with multiply here. Also we can add another multiply after our gradient, so it will increase the intensity of the particles as well, when they will be going through this gradient. Also, let's cut the base color input. And now let's export again and reload the page. Alright, the effect works nicely. Maybe we want to broaden the gradient a little bit, because it disappears pretty quickly, and we will need to tweak it a little bit more in Blender. Again, it is a pretty complicated setup. We have smoke particles which follow the object which is being animated, so we are going through and solving most of the possible problems that we can encounter. Here in Blender I will tweak the material a little bit, scale the empty a little bit, so we will broaden the gradient, and so on, little tweaks to make everything look better. I will make it time-lapsed. Alright, exporting and back to Verge. Alright, looks much better, though we still can see individual particles. So now we will make little tweaks here in Verge with our control panel. I will time-lapse it as well. Alright, and here we have finished result. It looks pretty nice, and again we had a pretty complicated setup. We have animated part which emits the smoke, and smoke doesn't go vertically. Most of the situations when we need smoke or steam are much easier. Just like here we have some fire and some smoke coming up. So in this video we mostly are problem solving complex setups, while if you want simple smoke you can just add one plane, call it 1, set the material and copy paste Visual Logic XML, and we will be done. Now let's talk about pros and cons of this method. For pros, well, we already have said, we have the simplest setup. We just copy XML logic, place a plane, call it 1 and set material for it. Maybe create 2 more planes, rotate the UV map, and the effect already is done. We don't need to worry about geometrical shapes of the smoke. We don't need to dance around the shader to make the smoke look smooth without any visible borders. We just have this control panel and we can change it almost in real time. The only downside here is we need to reload. And with that, let's move to the cons of these methods. Well, first we just talked about it. When we introduce some changes to the control panel, we need to reload the page. It will even work without it, but still we will have some artifacts that will go away after reloading the page. The second is kind of dangerous because we can set the density a little bit too much, and the browser even may crash or the page may crash because there will be too many instances or too many objects on the scene. But again, let's just not use really low numbers in density and everything will be good. And next, as for now, we don't have the wind effect, so it rises only in one direction. While with the first method, we can shape the form, the geometry itself, so it will kinda bend and make these wind effects. But I think it is possible, and I will be working on updates of this instrument. As for the usage, I recommend using this method for most of the projects where we need smoke. It is much easier to set up and works right away. Also, we can combine both methods. The first method will give us this flowy random effect, and the second one, well, will work as real particles. Alright, and that is all. The link to the Visual Logic XML file will be in the video description and on forums, so you can download it and try it for yourself. But still, there are some questions to be answered. How does it work? How does this whole big structure actually work? And that's exactly what we will talk about in the next tutorial. We will dive into particles logic and create this effect right from scratch. So if you would like to know how this effect was created, or even add something to it, change it or optimize it, stay tuned and see you in the next tutorial.